Imagine a country that discovers, I don't know, a huge uranium deposit or a massive gold mine. At first glance, it's a jackpot. It's really a gift from the sky. That's supposed to trickle down to pretty much the whole economy. In any case, that's often what's announced in the media, a little bit everywhere by politicians. There you go. A big chance that just fell on the country. Yet, if you come back a few years later, there's a good chance you'll find a country that has sunk into poverty with a lot of corruption, or even civil wars. How is that possible? Why did this wealth turn into a curse? It's a fascinating economic paradox known as the resource curse. And it explains what happened in countries like Venezuela or Russia, which initially had everything to succeed, and especially huge resources. And this curse is a theory that has been observed for centuries. The idea is simple. Resource-rich countries like those with oil, gas, and minerals often have slower economic growth, more corrupt institutions, and more unequal societies than countries that don't have them. So, put differently, this wealth can become a poison. Why? There are several reasons. The first one is what we call Dutch disease. This term comes from a 1977 article in The Economist, which explains the consequences of the discovery of natural gas in the Netherlands. Since gas was discovered in the North Sea in the 1960s, but ultimately a little bit everywhere in the country, the local currency, the florin, has become stronger. As a result, other sectors of the economy, like industry, became less competitive in exports. Why? Because the currency is stronger, exported products are more expensive than before, so they are less likely to find outlets. And this is a situation that is experienced by most countries that have been in the same situation. The problem is that everything is fine as long as the prices of raw materials, as long as extraction, production, etc. hold up. But as soon as the revenue from raw materials decreases, the country is left with the remnants of the economy. It holds up, but as soon as the revenue from raw materials decreases, the country is left with the remnants of the economy. The industry, as I was saying, is struggling to take over. It's a bit like having this raw material sector that is too strong to take over. It's a bit like having this raw material sector that is too strong. It will weaken the rest of the economy. The second mechanism is price volatility. We know that raw materials like oil or copper often have prices that are cyclical and even quite brutal cycles. When prices go up, everything is fine. The country's economy is doing very well, but as soon as it drops, it's a disaster. Think of a country like Angola, for example, where 90% of export revenues come from oil. All it takes is a drop in prices. And that's the budget collapse. It's impossible. In any case, not impossible, but let's say very difficult to manage a country whose revenues can drop 40% in just a few months. And finally, the third mechanism is that when there are a lot of raw materials, you also find a lot of corruption and what we call extractive institutions. So this concept of extractive institutions was popularized by economists Akemoglu and Robinson, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics, 2024. And this term refers to institutions that concentrate power and wealth in the hands of an elite. So instead of promoting growth and innovation for the whole of society, these institutions will extract the wealth that is produced. That's why we call them extractive institutions, capturing wealth for the benefit of a small group, often to the detriment of the population and the rest of society. A good example is Russia. Since the fall of the USSR, the Russian economy has heavily relied on its energy exports. That was a major strength, and this concentration of wealth led to the concentration of power and corruption. The revenues from oil and gas are controlled by state-owned companies. We know Gazprom well, we know Rosneft, which also serve as political leverage, and it creates a vicious cycle where the elites get richer. But the country as a whole remains economically fragile. But the most tragic example of the resource curse is perhaps Venezuela. In the late 1920s, the country discovers its first major oil reserves. So, very quickly, Venezuela becomes one of the biggest exporters, and by the 1970s, it is incredibly wealthy. The infrastructure develops, the middle class explodes, and everything seems to be going well. But starting in the 80s, everything collapses. Why? Because oil has become an addiction. Naturally, we tend to neglect agriculture, local industry, and so on. It's so much easier to import products by paying with petrodollars. But when oil prices fell, Venezuela found itself with an unsustainable budget. But not only did they mismanage the volatility of oil, there has also been a lot of corruption. Whether under Hugo Chavez or Maduro, oil revenues have often been used to fund populist programs, but also to enrich a small circle of close associates of power. The national oil company, PDVSA, is now poorly managed. Employees need second jobs due to low pay. Very efficient, very profitable, has become a black hole with truly disastrous management, to the point that today, employees are paid so poorly that almost all of them are forced to have a second job. No one can live solely off their work at the oil giant. As a result, even though Venezuela has huge oil reserves, it is often referred to as the largest oil reserves in the world. They still had to, at times, import Iranian oil. That seems completely crazy. But that's what has happened in recent years. So, why do some countries manage to do well? Why is Norway, for example, who discovered vast oil reserves in the North Sea in the 60s, is today one of the most prosperous countries, the most equal egalitarian in the world? The answer is management. From the very beginning, Norway made strategic decisions to avoid the curse. Basically, they did everything the opposite of the others. For example, they created their famous sovereign fund, where a large part of the oil revenues is invested for future generations. This sovereign fund, it's really fascinating. It's worth about $1.7 trillion today, knowing that there are about 5.6 million Norwegians. That comes to just over $300,000 per person. So, if you're a family of 4, you could say that Norway has about $1.2 million. It's invested to secure your future. And what's great is that it's completely transparent. If you go to the Sovereign Fund's website, I encourage you to do so. I'll put the link in the description of the podcast video. You can see its real-time value, so you can see how much it goes up or down. And above all, you can check out all its investments. You can see exactly how much it has invested in Apple, the number of shares invested in Apple, in Dassault, aviation, etc. But you also have the details of all the real estate, so you can see the buildings they own, whether it's on the Champs-Élysées. I saw that they own the building with the Nike store. You can see their property at Place Vendôme or in New York, London or Sheffield. But thanks to this fund, Norway is not directly affected by the volatility of oil prices. Instead of using it in its annual budget to pay for its current expenses, I want to say it's designed to manage the country for the very long term. So what's great is that as soon as the oil revenues come in, they're reinvested in a lot of stocks, a bit of bonds, real estate, etc. And it's for the future. So, of course, if you want to pay your bills with your petrodollars, that's complicated. And as soon as the price of oil drops, there are big problems. Exactly. Norway has understood this well. How to manage that in the long term? In addition, Norway has invested heavily in education, infrastructure, and diversified industries. Exactly. To avoid this dependence on oil, what they did was use oil as a springboard, not as a crutch. And maybe, like me, you're thinking about Dubai, the United Arab Emirates, etc. Indeed, they were inspired by the Norwegian model, but with some significant differences. Because Norway really went for a cautious model, transparent, very long-term, where oil revenues are placed in this sovereign fund that we've discussed, which is going to be used to finance the well-being of the citizens. And that's where it changes a bit compared to Dubai and future generations. That is to say, this fund will finance pensions, public services, etc. While on its side, Dubai has adopted a much more entrepreneurial model, as they are going to massively reinvest oil wealth into infrastructure and economic projects. But this time to attract foreign capital, expatriate capital, etc., without focusing on internal redistribution like Norway does. But in both cases, there is no resource curse. There is really very good management, and that's not just a lesson for states. We have exactly the same thing at the individual level. At the level of businesses, the same principle applies, meaning that wealth that comes too quickly is often poorly managed and can ultimately do more harm than good. We all know the story of lottery winners who end up broke, or these companies that will explode rapidly with really a product that will have enormous success, but then collapses because they didn't have a real long-term strategy. So no, the resource curse is not a fatality. I talked to you about Norway, we saw Dubai, but there's also Canada and so on. So there are still several countries with significant resources. We can almost include the United States in that group. We can have countries that have significant resources, raw materials, and yet they did not fall into poverty, civil wars, and so on. But we can see it's all about management, but it's also a question of institutions. It's, as I told you, on the theme of institutions, the 2024 Nobel Prize was awarded to these. I mentioned only 2 researchers, but there were actually 3. So there you go, strong, transparent institutions, etc. That's what saves us from the resource curse. Do you think that this resource curse is a bit of a shaky economic theory, a bit of a phony? Or do you really think that some countries would have been better off never finding oil or gas? We can think of Venezuela. Is it really a curse, a moment of stumbling upon this wealth and not knowing how to manage it well? I feel like this time of the resource curse is somewhat behind us. Was it really a curse, a moment of stumbling upon this wealth and not knowing how to manage it well? I feel like this time of resource curse is a bit behind us. That today, the countries which have these resources, I have already given you quite a few examples, are managing them much better. I have the impression that this is something of the past. But there you go. Let me know what you think in the comments. Thank you again for your loyalty and for subscribing. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the little bell. Or of course, like this video if you enjoyed it. I'll see you soon for more videos.